In this video, we will configure port security on our Cisco 3750 switch. We'll configure port security on switch port number 12, or Fast Ethernet 1012, where we previously obtained the MAC address of the device connected to this port. For the port security, we're going to configure sticky MAC address, which means that it will learn the MAC address on that connected port, which would be this MAC address. So keep that in mind. So let's go ahead and get started with that configuration. Before we enable port security, let's run through a couple of show commands to show you what the commands look like before we enable this feature. So let's scroll down, let's make some space, and the first command will be show port security by itself. Let's do enter. So here we see no secure ports or port security entries present. So it'll be reflected as the port, which is the secure port, and the details of how that is configured. So again, nothing here is reflected. But we do see the total or the maximum address limit in the system. This is the total number of MAC addresses that can be supported on the switch. And we talked about this in the presentation video, that this will vary based on the hardware switch or the model that you're using. So in our case, on our 3750 switch, we can support up to 6,272 secure MAC addresses on our switch. The other port security commands that we can use include the following. So let's scroll down and let's do port security, then question mark. We can do address or interface with port security. Let's start with show port security interface, followed by the interface that will be enabled for port security, which is Fast Ethernet 1012. So let's go back up, say Fast Ethernet, 1012. So this command provides information on how this interface is configured for port security. So first off, we see that port security is disabled because it is not configured yet. For the port status, it reflects a secure down. Now once we configure it and it is in policy, not violated, it should say secure up. We also see the violation mode, which is shutdown, the default. And other options that can be configured include protect and restrict. And we see other information here as well, like the maximum number of MAC addresses to the last source MAC address that is learned off of this port, and the number of security violations on this interface. So very good information that we can use to look at how this interface is configured for port security. And let's use the other command, which is show port security address. Let's type that in here, port security address. Now this will show very similar information that we did from the very previous command of just show port security. We can see the total number of addresses in the system and the maximum number of MAC addresses, the limit in the actual switch. So we see that same number here. But this will provide a table of all the MAC addresses and the associated port that is connected to based on its configuration. And the type defines how the MAC address is configured. Is it dynamically using sticky MAC addresses or statically configured into the interface? So this example in this video will be focused with configuring sticky MAC addresses, which means we will learn the MAC address of what is connected to that port. Then that will be applied as part of the policy. So those are very good commands that we can use. Now, let's go ahead and get started with configuring port security. Let's get into our configuration mode. Next, let's go under the interface of Fast Ethernet 1012. And the first thing we need to do is to configure this port as an access port. Now remember, we talked about this before, that port security can only be configured on an access port, not a trunk port. So let's configure that now. Next, we will enable port security. Next, we will specify the maximum number of MAC addresses supported on this interface, which will be 1, which means only one device, one host, can be connected to this port. Let's configure that now. Next, we will configure the sticky MAC address. So that means that the first, because only one can be connected, so the very first device that is plugged into this port which we already have our computer plugged into that port, it will learn that MAC address automatically and include that in the configuration, which you will see momentarily. So let's go ahead and configure sticky MAC address on this port as well. Say sticky. Next, we're going to specify, or we can show you how you can specify the violation mode. So let's go ahead and type that in now. Switch port, port security, and then violation. Now here, let's do a question mark. So these are the different options or modes that we can use. So we can actually go ahead and do protect, we can do restrict, or shut down. Now by default, it will shut down the port if something else is plugged in. So we're going to maintain that and say shut down. Now what that actually means is once it does shut it down, it will not shut down the port. It will put into an error disabled, and a different video will show that. But basically, this is all we need to do for configuring port security. So now let's look at that configuration under the port. Let's first exit out of the config mode. Next, let's do show run because we want to look at our configuration. But within that config, we want to look at the interface of Fast Ethernet 1012. So this reflects how our port is configured. We can see that it is enabled for the access port that we specified. Port security is enabled. Now the violation of shutdown is not listed here because that is the default, and default commands are not presented in the running config. But we do see our MAC address sticky command followed by another command, but with the MAC address, because this is the MAC address that we showed you from the MAC address table that is connected to that interface. So that information that is learned is automatically added to the switch port automatically. You will also notice that the maximum number of MAC addresses, which is 1, is also not reflected on here because that is a default as well. But just want to show you that configuration of what are the defaults, including what the sticky configuration looks like and what it does. Since port security is configured now, let's go back and look at those commands. So let's first do show port security. And this now reflects the following here. We see that we do have a secure port of Fast Ethernet 1012, which is what we just configured. That the maximum number of secure MAC addresses supported is 1. And the current count of what is connected is 1. So we are not in violation. And we know that because for security violation, the count is 0. If there is a violation, then the action will be to shut down that port. So very good summary information of reflecting all secure ports, how they're configured, their violation counts, and the action of that violation on the switch itself. And let's do one more command. So let's scroll down a little bit here. And let's do show port security interface. And this command shows how this interface is configured for port security, which is different from what we showed you before. First off, we see that port security is enabled on this port based on our configuration. That the port status reflects a secure up, which is what all port security ports should be in. 1, if they are enabled, and 2, if they are in policy with no violations. Otherwise, a different status will appear. We see the default violation mode here, which is shut down, and of course the default for the maximum number of MAC addresses, which is 1. But we see other increments. We see the total MAC addresses, which is 1, and we see sticky MAC addresses, which is 1. Well, this is based on the configuration that we applied of MAC address sticky, that we basically want to learn the MAC address of that connected port. So below here shows the last known source MAC address learned from this interface, which is only one device. And we know that because the total MAC addresses that are learned or connected to this port is 1. So this is a very good command to see what is the MAC address of that connected port. And if there are any violations, we will see this as well. And so far, so good. No violations. But that will later change in different videos.